The year 1068 marked a turning point for the Eastern Roman Empire, though few realized it at the time. Constantine X lay dying, his empire fracturing under the weight of Turkish raids, Norman invasions, and a treasury drained by years of neglect. His widow, Eudokia Makrembolitissa, faced an impossible choice: preserve her son's inheritance or save the empire itself. She chose both, or so she thought. Constantine X had been a disaster for Roman military affairs. A civilian bureaucrat elevated to the purple, he'd slashed army funding to pad the treasury, disbanded crucial frontier units, and left the eastern borders exposed. Armenian themes fell to Seljuk Turks. The Pechenegs ravaged the Balkans. Norman adventurers carved chunks from Roman Italy. The empire's professional military structure, carefully built over centuries, lay in ruins. Now, as Constantine gasped his final breaths, the empire needed a soldier. Eudokia knew this. The Senate knew this. Even Constantine himself had apparently known it, because his final wishes created a constitutional nightmare. Before dying, Constantine made Eudokia swear an oath never to remarry. This would protect his son's claim to the throne. But he also made her regent for those same sons, the eldest being only 14. A celibate empress ruling alone while Turks and Normans tore the empire apart. The math didn't work. Within months of Constantine's death, the Senate pressured Eudokia to break her sacred oath. They had a candidate in mind, Romanus Diogenes, a Cappadocian general with an impressive military record and exactly the kind of aggressive energy the empire desperately needed. Romanus was 45 years old, battle-hardened, and absolutely not interested in palace politics. He'd recently been arrested for allegedly plotting against Constantine, though the charges were murky. Some historians suggest he was planning a coup to save the empire from Constantine's incompetence. Others claim it was simple ambition. Either way, he sat in prison when Eudokia's proposal arrived. Marry the empress, become emperor, save Rome. Simple enough. On January 1st, 1068, Romanus Diogenes married Eudokia and was crowned emperor. The speed of this transition was remarkable. Less than a year after Constantine's death, a new military emperor stood ready to reverse the decline. Romanus moved fast. He understood that the empire's problems demanded immediate action, not careful deliberation. The Turks weren't going to wait while he settled into the palace. His first campaign came that same year. Romanus marched east into Armenia, pushing back Turkish raiders who'd grown comfortable operating in Roman territory. He didn't win any decisive battles, but that wasn't the point yet. He needed to show the army that Rome was fighting back, that the borders meant something again. He repaired fortifications, reorganized scattered units, and crucially, started rebuilding the military infrastructure Constantine had gutted. The soldiers responded. Finally, an emperor who understood warfare. But Romanus faced enemies closer to home than the Seljuk frontier. The Dukas family, Constantine X's relatives, watched their influence evaporate under this upstart general. They'd expected to control Eudokia's regency, to rule through the young co-emperors. Instead, Romanus held real power, and worse, he was competent. Caesar John Ducas, Constantine's brother, became the focal point of aristocratic opposition. The palace split into factions, military reformers behind Romanus versus civil bureaucrats protecting their privileges. The following year, Romanus launched another eastern campaign. This time he pushed deeper into Turkish-held territory, retaking fortresses and securing key mountain passes. Again, no apocalyptic showdown, just steady professional soldiering. He was rebuilding Roman credibility one strong point at a time. The strategy made sense. The Seljuk Empire wasn't a unified monolith, but a collection of competing Turkish warlords. You didn't need to destroy them all at once. You just needed to make raiding Roman territory unprofitable. Western problems demanded attention too. Norman advances in Italy continued unchecked. Bari, Rome's last major Italian stronghold, faced constant pressure. Romanus couldn't be everywhere simultaneously, so he did what Roman emperors had done for centuries. He threw money at one problem to focus on another. Treaties, subsidies, strategic marriages, anything to buy time in the West while he stabilized the East. By 1070, Romanus had achieved something remarkable. The empire's eastern frontier, collapsing just 3 years earlier, had stabilized. Turkish raids continued but met organized resistance. Roman armies operated offensively again. The treasury, while strained, funded these operations without collapsing. Soldiers received regular pay. Fortifications rose from ruins. These weren't flashy victories for chroniclers to celebrate, but they were exactly what the empire needed. Yet Constantinople's political situation deteriorated. The Ducas faction worked constantly to undermine Romanus. They spread rumours about his ambitions, questioned his loyalty to the young co-emperors, and positioned themselves as defenders of Constantine X's legacy. Eudokia stood by her new husband, but her support created its own problems. Critics whispered about the broken oath, the unseemly haste of the remarriage, the sidelining of Constantine's sons. Romanus understood military matters better than court intrigue. He'd rather face Turkish cavalry than navigate senatorial backstabbing. This would prove costly. While he campaigned on the frontiers, his enemies consolidated power in the capital. They placed their allies in key administrative positions, controlled information flowing to and from the army, and waited for their moment. In 1071, Romanus decided the time had come for a decisive blow against the Turks. 3 years of careful rebuilding had restored Roman military capability. Now he would demonstrate that restoration with an overwhelming show of force. He gathered the largest army fielded by the empire in decades, perhaps 40,000 men, and marched east toward the Armenian fortress of Manzikert. The campaign started well enough. Romanus moved methodically through eastern Anatolia, retaking cities, securing supply lines, demonstrating Roman power to local populations who'd grown accustomed to Turkish dominance. Armenian princes who'd wavered in their loyalties suddenly remembered their oaths to Constantinople. The army's sheer size impressed everyone who saw it march past. But size created problems. 40,000 men consumed enormous quantities of food and water daily. The logistics trains stretched for miles. Moving this force required careful coordination, something made harder by the army's composition. Professional tagmata troops formed the core, reliable veterans who'd campaigned with Romanus before. Then came thematic levies of varying quality, Armenian auxiliaries with their own agendas, and a large contingent of mercenaries including Frankish knights, Pecheneg horse archers, and crucially, Turkish Ghazis who'd taken Roman gold. That last group should have raised concerns. Using Turkish mercenaries against Turks created obvious loyalty problems, but the empire had employed this tactic for generations. Besides, Romanus needed every sword he could get. The target was Manzikert, a fortress controlling access to Armenia. Its capture would secure the region and send an unmistakable message. Rome had returned. Intelligence suggested the local Turkish forces were scattered, unprepared for an army this size. Romanus expected a siege, not a major battle. He didn't know that Sultan Alp Arslan had been campaigning in Syria when news reached him of the Roman advance. The Sultan faced a choice. His primary target was the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, where real power and wealth lay. A Roman army in Armenia was an irritating distraction from more important objectives, but ignoring it meant conceding hard-won territory and emboldening other enemies. Alp Arslan turned north. The armies converged on Manzikert in August 1071. Romanus took the fortress quickly, perhaps too quickly. He'd expected more resistance. Where were the Turkish forces? Scouts brought contradictory reports. Some said Alp Arslan was still days away. Others claimed Turkish cavalry had been spotted nearby. The uncertainty gnawed at commanders. Then Romanus made his first serious mistake. He divided his forces. General Joseph Tarchaniotes received orders to take a substantial detachment and sweep the surrounding area, clearing out Turkish raiders and securing the army's flanks. On parchment, this made tactical sense. In practice, it reduced Roman strength by perhaps a quarter, just as the Sultan's main force approached. Why split the army? Possibly overconfidence. Romanus had spent 3 years rebuilding Roman military capability and wanted to demonstrate it. Or maybe he genuinely believed the intelligence suggesting Alp Arslan was still distant. Perhaps he worried about keeping 40,000 men supplied in one location. Whatever the reason, Tarchaniot marched away with his troops, and suddenly the numerical advantage Romanus had counted on diminished significantly. The remaining force, still formidable, deployed in standard formation outside Manzikert. Heavy infantry held the centre, cavalry protected the flanks, archers positioned to disrupt enemy charges, Byzantine tactical doctrine, refined over centuries, proven in countless engagements. Romanus had used these formations successfully in previous campaigns. But Alp Arslan didn't fight like Romanus's previous opponents. Turkish tactics emphasized mobility over shock combat. Horse archers circled at range, loosing arrows, withdrawing before contact, refusing pitched battle. They'd probe for weaknesses, exploit gaps, exhaust enemies through constant harassment. Traditional Roman formations struggled against this approach unless they could force decisive engagement. August heat bore down on both armies. Romanus needed to either crush the Turks quickly or withdraw to better ground. Sitting in place accomplished nothing while supplies dwindled and Turkish reinforcements potentially gathered. He ordered an advance. The Roman army moved forward in good order. Discipline held, formations stayed tight. Veterans knew their business. Then the Turkish horse archers began their work. Arrows fell in waves, not devastating volleys that shattered units, but constant harassment that frayed nerves and created casualties. Roman cavalry tried to close the distance. The Turks simply rode away, turned, shot more arrows, rode away again. This continued for hours. The Romans pushed forward. The Turks gave ground. Neither side committed fully to decisive combat. Frustration mounted among Roman commanders. They were chasing shadows while men died to arrow wounds. Some officers urged withdrawal to regroup. Others pushed for a full charge to force battle. Romanus tried a middle approach, methodically advancing while maintaining formation. Late afternoon brought the crisis. The Turkish mercenaries in Roman service, whose loyalty had always been questionable, suddenly defected. They didn't just withdraw, they joined the attacks on their former employers. This treachery punched holes in Roman formations right when cohesion mattered most. Then Andronikos Doukas made his move. Caesar John's nephew commanded the reserve, positioned to reinforce the main line or cover a retreat. As the situation deteriorated and Romanus signalled for support, Andronikos did neither. He withdrew his entire command from the field, abandoning the emperor and claiming later he'd believed the battle already lost. Whether this was cowardice, incompetence, or deliberate sabotage remains debated. What's certain is that it transformed a difficult situation into catastrophe. The reserve's departure exposed the Roman rear. Turkish cavalry, which had been probing for exactly this kind of opening, immediately exploited it. The Roman formation collapsed. What followed wasn't organised retreat, it was rout. Units fragmented as soldiers tried to escape encirclement. Turkish horsemen cut down fleeing Romans methodically. Romanus, credit to him, didn't run. He stayed with the remaining troops, trying desperately to reform some defensive position. For hours after sunset, scattered groups of Byzantine soldiers fought on by moonlight, surrounded, overwhelmed. Eventually, someone struck Romanus down. He survived the blow, barely, and Turkish soldiers captured him. Morning revealed the full scope of disaster. Bodies littered the field, thousands dead, thousands more captured. The elite Tagmata units that had taken years to rebuild shattered. Experienced officers gone, equipment lost. Survivors stumbled back toward Roman territory in disorganized fragments. And the emperor himself, captive. When Alp Arslan learned his men had captured Romanus, he reportedly couldn't believe it. Byzantine emperors didn't get captured. It simply didn't happen. The Sultan treated his prisoner with surprising courtesy, perhaps recognizing that a humiliated emperor was worth more than a dead one. They negotiated terms. Romanus would pay ransom, cede some border fortresses, become effectively a client. The Sultan even provided escort for Romanus's return. But here's where Manzikert's real consequences began. While Romanus had been campaigning, his enemies in Constantinople hadn't been idle. They'd positioned themselves for his failure. News of the defeat gave them exactly the opening they needed. When Romanus returned to imperial territory, he found not relief, but civil war. The Ducas faction had already moved against him, declaring him deposed. Romanus tried to rally support. Some troops remained loyal. Others saw which way events were trending. The fighting was brief. Romanus lost. His captors blinded him, standard Byzantine practice for disposing of failed emperors, and exiled him to a monastery where he died shortly after from infected wounds. Michael Ducas, that same child emperor Romanus had replaced, was restored to the throne, or rather his family ruled in his name while he remained a figurehead. They immediately repudiated the treaty Romanus had negotiated. No Troy. Tribute would be paid. No fortresses surrendered. From a domestic political standpoint, this made sense. Why honour terms agreed to by a defeated usurper? From a strategic standpoint, it was catastrophic. Alp Arslan had been willing to settle for modest gains. The new government's refusal to honour the treaty told him Byzantine authority had collapsed. The empire couldn't enforce agreements, couldn't protect its borders, couldn't even maintain internal stability. So he didn't need to negotiate anymore. He could simply take what he wanted. Turkish warbands poured into Anatolia, not as a coordinated invasion initially, just opportunistic raids that met almost no resistance. Local themes lacked the military strength to repel them after Manzikert's losses. The central government was too busy with factional struggles to organise effective response, and the Turks discovered something remarkable. These weren't just raiding territories, these were settlement opportunities. Anatolia's highlands resembled their Central Asian homeland, good pasture for horses, defensible terrain, and increasingly empty as Roman authority retreated toward the coast. What started as raids became migration. Turkish families followed the warriors. They established camps, then villages, then small principalities. The Romans would mount occasional counter-offensives over the following years, reclaim some territory temporarily, but they never restored the pre-Manzikert status quo. The theme system that had defended Anatolia for centuries depended on soldier farmers who held land in exchange for military service. When Turkish raids made that land untenable, the system collapsed. Without the themes, there was no mechanism to raise local armies. Without local armies, there was no way to stop the migration. Within a decade, Turks controlled much of central Anatolia. Within 2 decades, they'd established the Sultanate of Rum, a Turkish state on formerly Roman soil. The empire's recruitment base, its agricultural heartland, its strategic depth, gone. This forced a fundamental transformation in how Byzantium functioned. It could no longer sustain large standing armies from its own resources. Future emperors would depend heavily on mercenaries, expensive and unreliable. It couldn't defend its borders in depth anymore, only hold fortified positions and hope. And it needed outside help, which is what prompted Alexios Komnenos to request Western assistance a few years later, the appeal that sparked the First Crusade. So when historians call Manzikert a turning point, they're not exaggerating. The battle itself was bad enough. The political chaos it triggered was worse. But the long-term strategic consequences, the loss of Anatolia and everything that followed, that's what made it genuinely catastrophic. One August afternoon didn't destroy the Byzantine Empire, but it started the process that would take another 4 centuries to complete. The Romans would survive, adapt, even thrive periodically. But they'd never recover what they lost when Romanus Diogenes gambled everything on a single campaign, and his own government made certain he'd fail. Romanus deserves more than history gave him. He inherited catastrophe, stabilized it through competent leadership, and lost everything because palace politicians valued power over survival. The cruelty of his fate, blinded and exiled after trying to save an empire that wouldn't save itself, captures something essential about Byzantium's decline. Talent wasn't enough. Success wasn't enough. You could do everything right and still lose if the system worked against you. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Manzikert mattered less than what came after. Defeats happen. Empires recover from military disasters all the time. What they can't recover from is choosing self-destruction over unity, which is exactly what Byzantium did when it tore itself apart rather than rally behind the one man who'd proven he could fight. The Turks didn't conquer Anatolia. The Romans abandoned it while fighting each other for an empire that was already slipping away.